welcome to the channel. Welcome to JJAtkinsArt. Today, we're going to do another caricature tutorial, but a little bit of a twist on this one. Today, we're drawing somebody not famous. Now, this young lady has given me permission to use the drawing for my channel, but we're also going to be taking a good look at the reference photos that were there for inspiration. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me introduce you to my good friend, Molly. So let me just say right off the bat here, what makes this whole thing unique is that I usually focus a lot on celebrity caricatures, and I do that for a very distinct reason. If I'm drawing people that I know in my personal life, I don't often have the ability to secure permission to use personal photographs, and that might be a violation of privacy. And with celebrities, since we all kind of know what they look like, it's easy to see whether or not I was able to achieve a resemblance in the drawing, as opposed to just drawing some perfect stranger you don't even know without any reference photos to go off of. So again, what makes this unique here is that Molly was kind enough to provide a couple of really good reference photos and gave me permission to use them in the video. So, if I haven't said so already, Molly, if you ever see this, thank you so much. You're an absolute sweetheart and I love you for this. Now, let's take a look at these photos. They're unique in a couple different respects, but let's just kind of break down what we're looking for here more than anything else. Again, the idea here is we're looking at these photos to try to get some sort of an idea of what we're going to caricature, meaning what are we going to exaggerate. Now notice the word choice I'm using here. I want to exaggerate things, and exaggerate doesn't mean just make everything big. And it might be tempting to do that. Molly has some very distinct features about her that really kind of lend themselves to making larger. And I think the first thing that might draw your attention is her eye. Another feature that stands out is her smile. She's not smiling in every photograph, so you're tempted to miss this if you don't have all three of these photographs to use as reference. But the one in the middle really tells us she has a large smile, and that gives us some room for exaggeration too. But it does also set up a bit of a problem. We're making her eyes big, we're making her mouth big. Now what do we do with the nose? We can't just make everything big. Again, that's not the nature of what we mean by exaggeration. So in order to help balance things out a bit, to kind of create this idea that her head only holds so much mass, so if we're stretching things around and making some things bigger, other things must grow smaller just to kind of compensate, well then that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to shrink down the nose, and I'm going to kind of find a couple of other areas I can do that as well. Now, if a different caricature artist might take a different approach to this, for example, I am starting to kind of notice in retrospect that the top half of her head might even bear some room for enlongment or enlarging there, and I chose not to do that. So again, you can make choices as a caricature artist and still get something completely different, but still resembles your subject. And I do think this is definitely one of those caricatures where I did really kind of grab one of that resemblance early on, and I never really kind of let it go. So, why don't we start taking a look at the drawing? I'm going to put up a little picture-in-picture display to kind of show us what our reference photos look like as we start building our drawing, and we'll go from there. Now, in having spent a little bit of time personally with Molly, I can tell you that one of the things that I really want to focus on in this caricature is making sure that I capture her smile. Spend a little time with her and you know that she smiles a lot. She's a very happy-go-lucky person, and so a smile is really kind of essential to capturing that resemblance because it's what you usually see on her face. So the middle photograph is where I'm going to spend a lot of my attention when I'm focusing on trying to capture the resemblance. But I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the picture on the left gives me something very interesting to work with, and by that I mean the crown on her head. The crown is a series of crystals that have been kind of wired together to form some sort of a tiara, and she absolutely loves this picture, so I had to include it, and it really helped inform some of the ideas of what I wanted to do with the background. That and the outfit she's wearing leads me to some sort of an impression that she's some sort of an ice queen or something just straight out of like Game of Thrones. So rather than try to render some background with the apartment or the ceiling fan behind her or anything like that, I decided to go with something of a wintry, kind of loose, snowy background. And again, it's just really vague. I just want to give the impression, the tone of it without actually having to draw it, and use that to kind of inform some decisions I made in the rest of her caricature. Yes, the crown's going to go in there, and we're going to represent that coat she's wearing is something of a fur coat to just kind of tie everything together. I wanted to get a little bit of a glow in those crystals as well, so it was a really kind of fun little exercise to pull off. Now at this stage of the drawing, I'm kind of working on what might be loosely considered to be like a second or a third draft, and you may notice that the drawing that I'm kind of tracing over doesn't really line up, and there's good reason for it. My first stage, at least in my drawing process, is just to try to get down some basic ideas of what's occurring to me at first glance with the resemblance. So I know that I'm drawing big eyes. I know I'm drawing big smile. I have some general impression of an idea of a head shape in mind, and I'm just trying to get that down as quickly as I can without really worrying about the resemblance, just the idea of the shapes that I'm looking for. Round eyes, triangular mouth, heart-shaped lower half of the face, you know? And once I get those in, yes, it doesn't look like her. That's the kind of the issue. I've got to work on the resemblance a little bit more by kind of tying that image together a little bit more tightly. So I get a loose rendition down of what I'm looking for, and now I can go in and kind of tighten things up and work on the resemblance. And the idea here is that when I was laying down that really, really loose drawing, I wasn't really kind of playing with the symmetry very well. One half of her face was just definitely very mismatched to the other half of her face, and so this is an attempt of me to kind of correct this, and really more than anything else, get the perspective of this third quarter view correct on her head. So, you know, the mouth had to be kind of lined up more center than when I had originally drawn it. Same thing with the nose. I also made a decision I wanted to shrink down that nose a little bit more than I'd previously done. I also noticed in the photograph, at least in one of them, she was arching her eyebrows slightly, so I decided to play off that as a little bit also. I noticed that when I tried that, it just kind of really worked with the photo. I was really kind of liked the look that it gave off, especially when I started establishing the hairline a little bit later. Now, I really wanted to make sure that I got some shadow in there as reference to make sure that I remembered where to place in some lighting for her cheekbones. So even though we won't see some of those cross-hatched shadows in our final line work, this is just a reminder to me that I got some shadow going in there a little bit later on to help that cheek pop out a little bit more. The rest is just a loose scratching of the hair, and you know, I know that there are some artists that kind of struggle with how to draw hair, and female hair can be especially tricky considering how long it is. I'm not saying I'm an expert at this by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the tricks I've kind of learned over time is that I just take my digital pencil and I make it as thick as I can, so it almost resembles locks of hair rather than strands of hair. And then basically I just draw in the direction I want the hair to go. So if it's combed in one direction, I swoop my lines in that direction. And again, because I'm using thicker lines, eventually they start to look more like locks of hair than just individual strands, and I can start to build form and shape off that. Now that I've kind of got the basic shape of her hair laid in, notice now the crystal crown goes in. The crystals are actually made of two components. You have the longer straight pieces that are kind of like a green color, maybe more of a turquoise, and then there's some more quartz kind of whitish crystals that are smaller, more like stones that kind of sit at the base of those longer green ones. Now that may not be very obvious right now in the pencil stage, but when we get into inks and colors, you'll see how all that pops a little bit later. As far as the outfit she's concerned, I did get some comments from some people that the outfit itself made her look a little heavier than she really is. Molly's not a heavy girl and by any stretch of the imagination, but the outfit she's wearing is meant to be a big outfit. Something that's a large, heavy fur coat with a big hood behind it. So again, it might betray this idea that she's a large woman when she in fact is not. And if that's the impression you got, I take full ownership off that. That's my fault. Okay, so getting back into the drawing itself here, let's focus now on our eyes. So, you know, I'm one of those people that when I draw, I kind of jump all around. I'll work on the forehead a little bit, maybe the cheek over here, then an eye, and then come back to the other one later. But since I've already got an eye drawn in here, we can go ahead and start talking about some of the detail work I put into it and the reasoning behind it. See, ultimately when it comes down to it, remember, the eyes were getting exaggerated here. And the eyes are the first thing you're going to look at in any portrait, in any caricature. So because I drew them so big, it just seemed necessary to go in there and add an enormous amount of detail to really kind of draw in your attention. So usually I get a little bit lazy with eyes, especially with the iris. I just put in a flat color, call it a day, maybe a little white dot for a highlight, and I'm done. But I really wanted to get these eyes accurate because they were such a big focus of this particular picture. So with my reference photos, I had placed them on my phone and I was able to zoom in on them and get them, you know, really, really enlarged so I could get a really close look at the color and the detail and try to get kind of all the swirls in there and stuff like that. Now you can't see it now, but when we get into the inking phase, I tried out a new little trick with the irises that I thought worked really well. I'm not going to talk about it now. I'll get to it when we get to that portion of the drawing, but stay tuned. I think it was an interesting little trick that I am going to start using in the future for any eye that I render if it needs that kind of detail. So next thing here is moving into, again, next phases of drawing. So I work in many layers when I do this, but it's now time to kind of get the mouth in, and I'm drawing the mouth separately from the eyes and the nose and the rest of the face, because I've kind of found that if I stop drawing and step back a little bit, some things might be a little bit misaligned. And in this case, the mouth was a perfect example. It really wasn't lined up and centered the way it should have been. And if I had drawn that and went into painting and coloring stages without correcting it or realizing that it needed correction, it would have ruined the whole piece, and I probably never would have published it, to be honest. So I did have opportunity to kind of correct that and move on from there. Now, let's talk about this smile for a little bit, because I think this bears a little bit of discussion too. Molly does have a big smile, no doubt about that. But it's important to kind of be sensitive to this as well, because she does have a big smile, and that might be something that's exaggerated to the fact that it might almost seem offensive. And I was very careful about that. I don't want to offend. This is not meant to be offensive. But Molly did assure me when we talked about doing the drawing that she was aware that she had a large smile, and she liked her smile. So I was hoping that it was something that she would kind of enjoy seeing rendered as an exaggeration. Having said that, though, again, the intent here is not to be insulting. So when I did go about the process of rendering the teeth, I wanted to make sure that I didn't make her teeth look ugly. That's the important factor here. She is a woman, she is an attractive woman, and her smile is attractive too. But when you draw teeth a little bit bigger, it can be tempting to kind of exaggerate them to the point that they look almost animalistic or even ugly. And that's not what I wanted to go for here, because that's not what the exaggeration was trying to achieve. So one of the things that I really had to be careful about was my lines. How much should the line work show? Should I hide some of it? Should I erase some of it altogether? How much of her gum should show? I want to be accurate to the photograph, and the photograph does show gum, but I don't want to show so much that, again, it seems like it's over the top and in some way, shape, or form insulting. The insult is never the point here. She does have a pretty smile, and it is my opinion that I rendered it in a pretty way, and I hope she feels the same. Same thing could be really said about any part of any head or that you draw. Again, hair is another example of this, right? She has very long hair. It's dark, but it does have some highlights in it. There's a temptation, not a temptation, but a risk, I guess I should say, of drawing it in such a way that it looks very wiry, and I really got to be careful to try to avoid that. But it's just a matter of just making sure that you go in there and, work on making sure that preliminary drawings represent what you want them to represent before you move into final stages that you can change later. I ended up having to come back here and draw this several times, and you can see this happening right now where I'm putting in some of the whites. The reason for the whites is because at this point I'm starting to move into final stages, and I want to make sure I have a really good understanding of how my light and my shadows are going to work, especially in her hair, before I move into a stage where there's kind of no backing up. Now, that's not to say I can't change anything. The beauty of digital work is that I can change anything anytime I want, but that doesn't mean it doesn't come without a certain amount of time and effort and ultimately time I didn't have. So I wanted to make sure that I was working efficiently, and that's why this stage of the drawing exists. Usually when I do caricature work, I don't do something of a shadow study like this, but because I was kind of, again, getting to a point where I wanted to make sure that I knew what I was doing, and I wanted to really kind of impress with this one, I took that opportunity to just kind of do that brief sketch of it, and once I was happy with it, now we go ahead and move into our final inks. And these final inks are going to be the last stage before we start coloring and getting into final rendition. Now, again, we have some unique problems to solve here. One of the biggest ones here is just making sure I'm very careful about my line weight. I've talked about line weight in some previous videos, but I don't necessarily know that I talk about it very often, so I'll hit on it again here with this drawing. When I talk about line weight, what I'm talking about is thickness of line. And if you pay attention to, say, the lines around her nose versus the lines around her eyebrows or the lines around her hair, you may see that there's several different thicknesses of line that I'm using to get this rendering done. And there's good reason for that. Thickness of line is a way that you can help cheat or give the illusion of form. So I'm putting thicker lines around areas that are away from the light, generally speaking. I'm putting thinner lines around areas that are towards the light, generally speaking. And then I'm also kind of doubling down on that mentality with things that I want to pop. So for instance, I want the shape of her head to really pop, so I'm putting a thicker line around that. Same thing with her eyes. I've got thicker lines around her eyelashes because I really want them to pop. But I've got much thinner lines around her lips because really with her lips, I want to be coloring them eventually, and the thinner the line, the easier it's going to be to hide it later because that lip is going to be all red and I don't want a bunch of lines around it. Same thing could be said around the line that kind of defines her cheek or her laugh line. I don't want that line too thick. The thicker I make it, the more masculine it looks for starters, and the more it looks like a wrinkle. And the reality is this line isn't really all that visible. That line is just there as a reference to let me know where to place a shadow, and a subtle shadow at that a little bit later on. You can kind of see that shadow starting to kind of get represented right now. Now that we're in the coloring phase, my first portion of putting in shadows is to add the red that I think makes flesh tone a little bit more rich and lifelike. And typically it's a little heavier in the shadow areas. So again, you can see where I've laid that in the cheek line, and eventually we'll take that black cheek line out altogether. So that way it's not so bold and distracting. A similar approach was also taken to that word I can't remember now that represents that little divot that sits right underneath your nose above your upper lip. I had some black lines there. I got rid of them because the shadow was really all I needed to represent it. So again, we're in final stages of coloring right now. You can see that I've kind of got my base colors in. Shadows are coming in. We'll get into the lights in a little bit. And then this last stages here, what we'll do is kind of work on those crystals to try to get them to glow a little bit. But more than anything else, what I'm doing at this point, even though you can't see it on screen, is I'm going right back to my reference photos, and I'm using especially the one with the crown to inform where I'm putting in my shadows and my lights. So I don't have to do any guesswork here. I've got photographs that lay this out clearly for me. And even though I didn't really make a big deal about it before, I do want to stress the fact that one of the things that made this caricature so successful was the photographs that I had as reference. I randomly reached out to Molly and asked her for a couple photographs based off a conversation we'd had the night before about possibly doing some drawings. And she just sent that over, 3 or 4 pictures that all looked like that. And the thing about it is that I don't think she realized it, but they were lit perfectly. That's what makes a really good reference photo, is something that's high def, crystal clear image, but the lighting gave me really good ideas where the shadows were and really good ideas where the light source was. And so it was very easy to duplicate that in the drawing. I've got a lot of my shadows in already. I'm working on the lights now, and notice how I pop in that light right along the line where the hairline is, and you'll see something similar happening on the left side of her cheek. This is all from the reference photograph, and the thing about it is that I really think it helps everything pop, look a lot more three-dimensional, and I think we really kind of traverse this nice little line between caricature and portrait. So let's take a final look at how we got to where we ended up here. Here's our end stage right here. By the way, Molly said that she really liked the picture, so thank you, Molly. And here's how we got there. We start with a rough sketch that doesn't have a lot of resemblance. We move into kind of honing in that resemblance a little bit more. Once we kind of get that basic roughed in, then we start working on making sure that our detailed lines look really pretty. And then we can eventually start getting into doing a shadow study, adding in some lights, kind of getting an idea where those lie. Now we can move into the inking stage. Once we have a good set of inks ready to go, we fill in our base colors. And our base colors give us the opportunity to lay over top of them shadows, lights, and highlights, along with a little bit of a texture to give us our final product. So I hope you like what you're seeing there. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. In the meantime, come back. I got more videos coming soon. Thanks for staying tuned all this time, and I hope to see you again. Take care.